Okay, so what we're going to do in this section is add identity to our application, and we're going to take advantage of what Microsoft provides off the shelf in terms of ASP.NET identity, and that's what we're going to be adding to our application. Now, this course is about clean architecture, but we're going to compromise on a few aspects here to get identity added in. Now, in the previous version of this course, I had handlers for all of our account activities, such as login, register, etc. But in this version of the course, I'm shifting that policy, and I still want to add identity, but adding handlers for the login, the register, get current user, etc. just adds a lot of unnecessary boilerplate, and we don't have to use handlers for everything. What we can do, and what we're going to do in this section, is contain our identity into our API project. Our API is going to be responsible for authenticating users and registering and logging in and generating the token that we're going to give to the user so that they can authenticate to our application. And we're not going to involve our application project at all in this. But what we are going to do is involve our domain project. We still want an entity where we can store our user. And this is important for what we're going to be doing later on when we take a look at relationships and how we join our activities table and our users table that we get from identity. So slightly different to how we have been doing it, but what I found is it makes it much easier to get your head around identity by doing it this way. And it also simplifies our code and we write less code. So I've chosen to do it this way for this part of the course. Everything else that we do when it comes to our operations and our business logic is all going to be contained in the application project. But for this one, we're going to retain ourselves or restrain ourselves to just use the API for this aspect of the course. I promise you it makes it easier to develop our application. And I also promise you that we write a lot less code by doing it this way. An identity is something that may or may not be part of your application. You may be using an authentication service and therefore not have any identity in your own project. You might be using a third-party authentication service, for instance. So we are going to add identity into the app, and as I mentioned, we'll be doing it in a slightly different way and not using the CQRS pattern to do so. So what we're going to start with though, in our domain project, we are going to use this to create a user entity. And what we'll do is we'll right click, create a new class, and we're going to call this app user. Now what we want for this particular class is we want to use or derive from the identity user. So we'll say colon and then identity user. And we need to get this from Microsoft ASP.NET Core identity namespace. We don't have this at the moment, and because we need to do this at our domain entity level, this does mean that we're going to need to add a package into our domain project. So what we'll do is we'll open up the NuGet gallery, and what we need to add here or search for is Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.identity. And what we want here is Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity Entity Framework Core, which contains this identity user. And we're going to install this into our domain project, as I mentioned, and we're just going to go ahead and install. And once this is done, what we should find is that if we use the quick fix on identity user, then we're going to be using Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity. Now, if we take a brief look at identity user and just press F12 to go inside this class, then we can see all of the different properties that this will give us. But we need to go up a level to identity user that this derives from. And if we go and take a look, then we can see all of the different properties that we automatically get by deriving from this particular class. Things like the password hash, whether we've confirmed the email, a normalized email, a username, an ID, and access failed count. We get all of these properties automatically simply by deriving from this particular class. Now we will add a couple of properties of our own. So we're going to add a string for the display name, and we're also going to add a string for the user's bio, a description about themselves. But what we also get when we create a user based on this, we've got access to all of the other properties that we've seen, such as the ID, the email address, the username, etc. And in here, we're just going to add the additional properties that we want to track with our user objects. What we'll take a look at next is using Entity Framework to scaffold our database with all of the user classes available from ASP.NET's identity.